And so imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. See, I like that one. The single-mindedly part is an interesting one. What I learned this at least in part from Nietzsche is, when you're a kid, in principle you could be anything, which is kind of one of the wonderful things about being a kid. And then one of the painful things about growing up and being an adult is that, well, you can't just stay being everything. That's the story of Peter Pan, right? Pan means everything. And Peter Pan is this magical child, who can do anything, but he's got a strange kingdom, right? He's king of the Lost Boys, which perhaps isn't a kingdom that you want to rule over. And he doesn't grow up. And so he falls in love with Wendy. And Wendy grows up and she has a family. She gets old. She stops being a child. But she has a family. She has a husband and she has a family. She has a life. And Peter Pan just stays in Neverland, which is also a hint on the part of the reader. And he stays magical and contents himself with Tinkerbell, who I always think of her as the porn fairy. And oh, that. Yeah, she's got all the advantages of femininity, except she's not real. Yeah. Yeah. And so, Peter Pan, he doesn't want to grow up, partly because his role model is Captain Hook. And Captain Hook, well, you think about it, he's a pirate, so he's kind of a tyrant. And he's also a coward. And he's a coward because he's afraid, at least, because he's being chased by a crocodile with a clock in his stomach. You think, what the hell does that mean? He's being chased by a crocodile. What does that mean? It's like, well, and it's already got a piece of him, right? It's bitten off his hand. It liked the taste. Well, it's time. That's why the clock is there, It's time. And the crocodile is the terrible force that lies underneath everything, that waits to pull you down, like it's mortality itself, or the threat of mortality. And the reason that Captain Hook is a tyrant is because he's afraid of death. And so that makes him a tyrant and a cowardly tyrant. And Peter Pan looks at the cowardly tyrant and he thinks, well, I don't want to grow up to be that. And it's like, well, fair enough, but what are you going to do? Not grow up? Well, then you stay king of the Lost Boys and you have Tinkerbell and life goes on, and that's not a good outcome. And so, you have to make a sacrifice when you grow up. You have to become something. And to become something means to not become a whole bunch of other things. Like it's a sacrifice. It's the same sacrifice that you undertake when you decide to get married. It's like, well, you forego everyone else to have one person. And it's a real sacrifice, and it's a sacrifice that preys on people's minds because they think, well, maybe I could have picked someone better. It's like, because you always suffer from the delusion that someone better would have agreed to have you. And well, it's funny. I just read this great article. I tweeted it a couple of nights ago. I read this great article about how people select potential mates on dating sites, and people generally go for those who are about 25% more attractive than they are. So, which is, ambitious and pointless. But that is what people do. They hope that I don't know what they hope. They hope the person won't notice. It's like, I'll just slip myself in here and maybe you won't notice. It's like, well, so there's a sacrifice, but the thing about the sacrifice is that you end up with something rather than nothing at all. And I've seen lots of people in my clinical practice, who didn't grow up when they should have, and who are 30 which isn't too bad, although it's not that good, but 40, they're still drifting. They still haven't catalyzed an identity of any sort. And that starts to get ugly, 30 starts to get ugly around 30. If you're 23 or 24 and you haven't catalyzed an identity, it's okay. People think, well, you're mostly Peter Pan. You're full of potential, man. We'll gamble on the potential, and take a chance at you. But then if you're 30 and you have the same non-existent resume, people think, well, you just failed. It's not potential. It's just, you're just not there. And if that's the case at 40, that's getting really rough. Like, it's not completely hopeless if you're in that situation at 40, but man, you got a lot of catching up to do. And so how do you get out of that? Well, partly, and this is one of the things you also have to let young people know, is pick something. You don't know what to do. Well, take your best damn shot at it. Don't wait around, man. Make a plan. Aim at something. Move in that direction. Adopt a disciplinary routine of some sort, because that will form you. Now, it limits you too, but it forms you. And then, and the thing about adopting a disciplinary structure, which limits you and which is a sacrifice, is that it also increases the probability that you're going to do something useful over the long run. When I was starting out as a researcher, my area of research was somewhat narrow. I was looking at factors that influenced the inheritability of alcoholism, because alcoholism is heritable to a large degree. And it's partly because the manner in which you respond to a drug of abuse is determined in part by biological factors, and that the variance in those biological factors is biologically determined to a fair degree. So I'll give you an example. I had this friend, his name was Frank Irvin. He was a very cool guy. He looked like Ernest Hemingway, and he had a big beard, and he was a cool character, and he had this ranch in St. Kitts. It was a monkey ranch. I know, a monkey ranch. And he was raising alcoholic monkeys, and because he was a researcher, and he would take these wild monkeys, green monkeys, and bring them into an enclosure, and then he would give them rum and coke. And 5% of the monkeys would drink to coma on first exposure. And he had videotapes of that, which were really hilarious. They looked like frat party, fundamentally. And most of the monkeys would have a few sips and discuss their monkey business in a civilized way, in a corner, and then go home, when it was time to call it a night. But there was 5% of them, and they were like hanging off the trees by their tail in their arms by the end of the evening, and passed out completely. And anyways, one of his discoveries was that in a wild population of primates who were relatively naive to alcohol, that if you exposed a certain proportion of them, 5% of them had no control whatsoever over their drinking. They just drink right to coma. And that's about the same with people who start to experiment with alcohol. So anyways, that's one of the examples that that there was a biological influence. Anyways, this area of inquiry was somewhat narrower than I had hoped for. I hadn't really planned on studying the psychobiology of response to alcohol. I was interested in drug abuse and drug abuse motivation. I was interested in wider issues. But what was so cool was that the deeper I got into that, so the more I disciplined myself with regards to that particular domain of study, the more I learned about all sorts of other things. It was like going through a keyhole and then out the other side. And most disciplinary processes are like that. And so one of the things you have to do is you take the pluripotentiality of childhood and you discipline that. So that might be a meta rule. Like, you couldn't say, well, here's the disciplinary structure everyone should undertake. That's too specific a rule. Everybody should go into the military. It's like, no, not necessarily. Who knows what your disciplinary strategy should be? But you can make a more abstract rule, which is something like, I don't care what your disciplinary strategy is, but you need to impose one on yourself, and for some reasonable amount of time, because you integrate yourself as a consequence of doing that, as well as making yourself, vaguely socially useful and appropriate, which is also a non-trivial thing. And then once you have yourself disciplined, then you can take that disciplined self and you can start expanding it outward again. And so that's a really useful thing to know. So this is Nietzsche, who is a great critic of Christianity, was an admirer of Catholicism, interestingly enough, because one of the things he believed was that the attempt over several thousands of years to force every phenomenon into a framework that could be explained by the axioms of Catholic belief disciplined the European mind. It made it capable of producing rigorous and coherent theories, independent of whether the theory was correct. That wasn't the issue. It was like, well, once you learn how to write, you can write essay A, but you could also write essay B. If you don't know how to write, you can't write either. maybe you learn to write by writing essay A, but then you can write essay B and C. And the same issue applies here is once you get yourself disciplined, then you can take the disciplined self and you can go do a bunch of different things with it. And so maybe it doesn't matter how you discipline yourself, but it really matters that you do. And so that's an important thing, I think. I think it's an important thing for everyone to know, but I think it's really an important thing for young people to know. It's like, well, I don't know what to do with myself. Well, don't sit around and get old. That's a bad idea. And spin around doing nothing. It's like, pick something. Make a mistake, right? Pick something that you're not sure about and go and pursue it. You get a quarter of the way there, halfway there, you're a lot smarter because you've had to undertake a fair bit of learning just to get that far. Maybe at that point you find out it's not for you and you decide to make a left-hand turn, you make a 90-degree turn somewhere else. At least you've fleshed yourself out in the pursuit of the discipline. And don't wait around. And I think that's what that chapter's about.